Hi, this is Paul. In a recent video, I pointed a bunch of people to Kent Hendricks' Substack. I think I'll probably have him on the channel sooner, if not later. I've got some weddings coming up, and that'll interrupt my video production, and so it'll interrupt some of this. But I'll be around during Synod, so one of the weddings is before Synod, and one of the weddings is after Synod. But Kent Hendricks has his latest piece on Substack, Why is it so hard for affirming churches to leave the CRC? And he's got some good ideas in there. And what's been interesting is that Kent has been clearly sort of following my ramblings on the channel, integrated some of those ideas, tweaking them and adding some of his own. So we're having a nice bit of flow here back and forth. I'll put a link below to this to his Substack and to this, and it's a free Substack, so you can just read it. But I'll start reading it, and I'll do some commenting. I've also been sort of processing it on CRC Voices. It's much harder for left-leaning churches in the CRC to leave than for the right. For example, in Neelan's appeal to Synod 2023 in response to the In Loco committee report, the council wrote, Neelan feels a strong covenantal relationship to and with the Christian Reformed Church. All of them do. There are 17-ish affirming congregations in the CRC. That's 17 out of 1,000. That doesn't mean that there aren't other congregations that perhaps don't have some sympathies or have council members with some sympathies in that direction, but only 17 to 20 or so have actually come to the point that they're looking to put some sort of affirming statement on their website, or at least report themselves to All One Body or the Hesed Project. For example, Overture 34 from Classis Minn Coda. Classis Minn Coda is a classis that has sort of become an affinity classis in the Christian Reformed Church, a conservative affinity classis, states as follows, that Synod 2024 require Classis Grand Rapids East at their fall 2024 classis meeting. If there is no public repentance from Neeland Avenue, do depose the Council of Neeland Avenue CRC. One of the issues that's involved is there's no real mechanism for Synod to depose, to sort of work down through the levels and depose a local church council. Now, part of what has happened in the Christian Reformed Church was that a few years ago, Synod basically ran out a particular local church on the charge of heresy for kinism. And what happened was when that happened, a lot of people said, oh, look, Synod has a new superpower. And then when the votes all turned the other way against the progressives, there was this concern that, oh, wait a minute, maybe Synod can sort of clean things up with this new superpower. And so then there are all these reports about, well, heresy means this and doesn't mean this. And basically Synod did this one-off thing and then quickly tried to detooth that thing because people sort of realized that, oh, what you did just sort of ran roughshod through the church polity system. And if Classis Grand Rapids East doesn't depose Neelan Council, then Minn Coda overtures that Synod 2024 requires Synod 2025, if there's no public repentance from Classis Grand Rapids East, to depose all the church councils of Classis Grand Rapids East. Now, again, there's no specific mechanism for that, but part of what makes the Christian Reformed Church different from a lot of other older denominations is a lot of denominational machinery sort of develops through time and especially through conflicts. And the Christian Reformed Church really hasn't had a conflict like this in all of its history. Now, these overtures are sort of from what would be, let's say, the far right of Christian Reformed Church politics. But it doesn't mean they couldn't pass. And it'll be interesting to see what gets done with them. There are many such overtures and communications to Synod 2024, along with the unofficial comments on podcast, Facebook groups echoing the same thing. What makes these churches want to stay? Now, this very much gets into Redeem Zoomer's story. I had Redeem Zoomer on the channel not too long ago. I've written elsewhere, we'll go over to there, the returning church kept the CRC from splitting. Basically, what the internet afforded, Returning Church Group was a Facebook group of conservative pastors and CRC members that sort of then found some community. And then Abide Project sort of did the same thing. There's some discussion between how much commonality there isn't between those two groups. But basically his thesis was the natural geography of Classis Grand Rapids East and the establishment in Western Michigan afforded them a capacity for cooperation and collaboration that dispersed conservatives throughout the denomination didn't have. Many of those conservatives being mostly in rural areas instead of urban areas. And I've spoken and he's written about the circulatory system where, in fact, rural urban areas have contracted. And so part in his telling, and I think he's probably right, of the change in the Christian Reformed Church happened because of the internet. Because now suddenly via Facebook and social media and Zoom, now suddenly conservatives could organize. And once conservatives organize, that in keeping with the continual process of the Christian Reformed Church getting more conservative, and the end of the circulatory system, that then has given the conservatives their numerical strength, and now sort of with enough moderates their 70-30 numerical advantage in the last two synods. As I've written elsewhere, that's when there's trouble in the CRC, people on the right leave in institutional ways and people on the left leave in individual ways. Now I think he gets this from me because for a very long time, I've made the observation that in church splits, basically churches split to the right and churches split right and leak left. And that's basically a similar thing to what Redeemed Zoomer is sort of trying to prevent in the PC USA. And part of what's made the Christian Reformed Church so interesting in this is that while there was a split off to the right in the 1990s because of the Women in Church Office decision, the conservatives have managed to hold together and to organize, and that has meant that they have basically stood their ground and they are winning the fight. Now, we will see what happens in Synod 2024, if they will manage to keep their coalition together and present some sort of effective discipline against churches in Grand Rapids East and a few other churches in the rest of the denomination. When the right leaves, they move so in an institutional way. Example, First CRC Ripon, just down from here in my classis, is more likely to leave the denomination in opposition to the left, but Neeland Avenue hasn't left the denomination in opposition to the right. Now, there are a whole bunch of factors to this, one of them being that even though First Ripon was one of the oldest Christian Reformed churches in the state of California, they were never an establishment church. You can go back 100 years in the Christian Reformed Church, and you will find many key leaders, dead and alive, who have been through Neeland Avenue Christian Reformed Church. There is a sense in which these establishment churches have a degree of felt ownership over the denomination and its institutions in ways that churches out on the fringe will never have. When the left leaves, they are more likely to do so in individual ways. For example, Marcianne Rienstra, the first woman to receive her MDiv from Calvin Seminary, was denied candidacy by Synod in 1979. She, not Church of the Servant, which appealed to Synod on her behalf, left the denomination. How the right leaves in institutional ways. Almost 100,000 people, that's a big number. He should talk to David Snapper. David Snapper usually puts that number more like 60,000. Have left the Christian Reformed Church since the early 90s. Okay, so he's looking at that number. He's looking at the whole number. And I would say of that whole number, there's a lot of left leaking. And there's a lot of leaking to the, let's say, the urban monoculture. People deconstructing out of Christianity. That's a part of that big 100,000 number. 60,000 or so left during the URC split. Usually in response to perceived leftward drift. In nearly every case, when the right leaves, they do so by splitting a church. There are public votes, followed by a pastor's resignation from the denomination. And then there's public joining of the URC or some other conservative denomination. Usually takes a bit more than that. But the kinds of splitting that happened during the URC departures definitely was far more institutional. And then he makes the observation the right is more anti-institutional than the left. And there's a degree of truth to that, but I don't know if I would say it quite in that way. The right turns the institution against itself. I think a lot of this tends to be more... I'm not sure if I agree with a lot of his framing in this, and so I did some writing this morning. I responded to someone on CRC Voices wrote a piece, basically an imaginative tale. It was really nice really nice example on Voices of how we as human beings use narrative to try to interact with problems that are complex in nature. Because narratives can engage complex problems, distinguishing complex from complicated. Narratives can engage complex problems and help us to engage complex problems in ways that analogy usually sort of fails, because there's too much complexity, often with sort of trying to use analogies to sort of test case things, A versus B. So what I did was I ran through some of this stuff with respect to, again, Mueller's, my adaptation of Mueller's Sincerity and Authenticity. The observation that the culture of sincerity, fulfilling inherited traditional obligations, versus authenticity, encouraging expressions of felt innate purposes, goes in different ways. Again, back to Kent's Substack today. Why it's so hard for affirming churches to leave the CRC. There's something to this question of institutions. Both sides want something from institutions, but work different ways of getting it. It is not the case that people who are, say, more authenticity prone in the Christian Reformed Church, and again, I myself, most of us are mixtures of sincerity and authenticity. I'm probably heavy on the authenticity end, just in terms of how I was brought up and where I've been and all of these things, even though once you bring these things to consciousness, you begin to balance them in different ways. So the culture of sincerity, the way tribe authenticity does institutions looks like betrayal. To the tribe of authenticity, the sincerity people look like authoritarians, and you'll hear this charge of authoritarians again and again, both in the political sphere and in the church sphere. Well, why? Well, because again, if you look at, let's say, the change that many political and governmental institutions have arisen, let's say, in the, let's think about it. Now again, this isn't just, you can't just have clean lines historically within this, but basically a lot of government development has afforded a culture of authenticity. Again, I can go back to Yuval Harari's Sapiens when he talks about the fact that part of the reason that, let's say, government institutions began to get at odds with family institutions was that, well, now you no longer need children because you've got Social Security. Now you no longer need an extended family network because you have a social welfare system. Now you no longer need a family network because you have insurance. We won't just pick on government institutions, but we can pick on private institutions. Now you no longer have to develop into the family business because you can put your money in the stock market. In other words, public institutions have been in competition with sort of more implicit family private institutions that had been the mainstay of, let's say, human survival for a very long time. A culture of sincerity will tend to prioritize, again, keeping traditional roles that you were born in, maintaining those traditional structures. And so when you read, for example, the church order of the Christian Reformed Church, I go back to the first time I read that document when I was in seminary. It's not a very long document to read through, and it's changed a bit since I've been in seminary. But when I read it, I thought, wow, this document is a document of a culture, I didn't have those words back then, that really wants to maintain its dogmatic tradition. Now, there's a proposal that the whole church order be rewritten, and my guess is that institutionally it would shift over much more into a writing of institutions of authenticity rather than institutions of sincerity. So I was chatting with someone on text, and he'll know as soon as I mention what happened here, that he was telling me how his church Thursday night had an Ascension Day service. Orthodox churches are in church all week for their Orthodox services. Now these, and when people brag about them, these are brags of sincerity, because it is a move of sincerity when you go to church because the church demands that you go to it. It's an institution of authenticity that is always sort of there and is available to you when you feel in your heart that going to church this day would be an authentic thing to do. And so in many ways, institutions of authenticity are consumer institutions, and institutions of sincerity have quite a bit more bite to them. You lose status if you drop your evening service in the Christian Reformed Church in a sincerity community. You lose status if you drop your Ascension Day service or your other holiday service. And if in fact your church has these service and you don't go to it, you lose status. You don't lose status in a culture of authenticity when you say, well, I just want the church to be open so that when I go, I'll be able to express myself. Now, again, these lines aren't clear at all because, let's say, for example, many cathedrals are open a lot and public can go in, and then they're sort of used as an institution of authenticity, even if it's a very traditional institution. So how these things work is very interesting, because even though, let's say, Grand Rapids probably has a fairly high degree of institutions of of authenticity, because they have so much ownership in it, they'll have some sincerity tendencies to them, and vice versa. But the whole purpose of these institutions is, well, to afford either expressions of authenticity, and you can understand, well, we've certainly got to adapt. We've got all these people for whom marrying someone of the opposite sex, or at least not having, let's say if they're bi or queer or something like this, not being able to mold their own particular sexual expression, well, it would be authoritarian for the institution to put them in a box. No, you must marry someone of the opposite sex. You may not sleep with someone you are not married to. These are all functions of an institution of sincerity. These are not the functions of an institution of authenticity. An institution of authenticity is there to afford persons seeking authentic expressions of themselves. And so then even when you get to confessionality, institutions of sincerity are going to basically say, well, this should express who you are now. Now, again, let's be fair. There's a great degree of authenticity in, let's say, my estuary movement, because estuary meetings are very unscripted, and they're by design. You don't lose status for not, let's say, fulfilling your cultural roles. So here you can see these two different institutions, and you can see the two cultures of institutions. Now, part of why churches split right and leak left is that people who are in a culture of authenticity can find themselves having ways of expressing themselves in any different places. I don't need to go to a church to worship God. I can go into nature. I can go into a national park. I can do it at home alone in my room. I can set up my own little shrine. And see, this is where even, people that say are going to orthodoxy can be expressing desires of authenticity in orthodoxy. I go to the church that I choose, and I like the icons, and I like the liturgy, and I like all of these things, so I am going to make orthodoxy my consumer choice. Whereas, let's say, if you're within a particular ethnic group or familial tradition, well, your job is to continue the inheritance that's been given to you and to maintain that tradition. And so you try to fulfill your culture of sincerity. Now, I think this also has implications in terms of how these institutions actually manage to sustain themselves. And you can see some of this. Tribe authenticity really rallies around threats to authenticity, but struggles if there is both poverty and no obvious threats. In other words, there's sort of a reactionary way that team authenticity produces their institutions. Because again, their institutions by design are there to try to afford authenticity and expressions of authenticity. Team sincerity is working a very different game. Team authenticity tends to do better accumulating smaller, that should have been sincerity. Team sincerity tends to do better accumulating smaller donations. See Abide, see the Christian Reformed Church for the last 100 years. People saving their little pennies, and all those little pennies adding up. And when Abide was organizing, they didn't go to Classis Minn Kota and say, we need $10,000 in order to start an activist group in order to keep the Christian Reformed Church more conservative. No, the money was given. They didn't have to ask any Classis for this. Part of what surprised me in my conversation about Better Together was just how institutional it was. But again, the funding for this institution, it's funded in a very different way than Abide. And so, but now here's where you're not going to have clean lines like sincerity is ancient and authenticity is modern. The internet, as I said earlier, really helped conservatives in the Christian Reformed Church organize. There's a fair amount of authenticity in conservative Christian Reformed team sincerity. And in terms of Grand Rapids East, vice versa as well. They are trying to maintain a tradition. They are the ones who teach at Calvin College. They are the ones who work in the denomination building. Their parents and grandparents have worked in all of these institutions because for a very long time, in terms of the circulatory system, money has been leaving the hinterlands of the Christian Reformed Church and accumulating in Grand Rapids and paying the salaries of people in Grand Rapids who are ostensibly serving the rest of the body and the rest of the world. That's how the circulatory system worked. It worked in terms of money, it worked in terms of people, it worked in terms of all sorts of things. So I think it's helpful to understand that these dynamics, even though these dynamics aren't, let's say, necessarily terribly straightforward. And for this reason, when, let's say, the right breaks or splits, well, they start institutions because they need their institutions of sincerity in order to keep everyone in line. And they're usually pretty strong institutions because in some ways they've made a consumer choice and elected their authority. And so there they have the consent of the governed. This is also part of the reason why they bristle. They don't have a problem with people in Grand Rapids funding whatever they want outside of church structures. But when ministry shares go to pay, for example, the Office of Social Justice or the Banner or things like this, well, that's the way it goes. Now, it's interesting, too, in terms of the practices that, for example, with the Banner used to be, this is very interesting, the Banner used to be, when the Christian Reformed Church was much more sincerity culture, the banner was subscriber paid for. Many things in the Christian Reformed Church, many current Christian Reformed Church agencies began as individual institutional efforts that sort of grew up from the grassroots. And the banner, which was a weekly magazine, was subscriber paid for. A number of years ago, they brought it into the ministry share system, and they said, well, we don't have to do so many other mailings from other things. We can promote the denomination through the banner, and we'll send the banner to every church and every household, and the banner comes free, but the banner only comes once a month. And, well, but it's funded centrally. So again, the idea is that now the banner, and I would say that the banner, for the most part, they try to be balanced, but for the most part, the banner very much comes from team authenticity rather than team sincerity. So again, looking at Edith Bunker and thinking about a sincerity culture and an authenticity culture, I think this is a very helpful way of seeing why the Christian Reformed Church is having the fight that it's having. You can see this in the Roman Catholic Church. You can see this in the, let's say, the renewed interest in cultures of sincerity. Now, a lot of what's motivating those cultures of sincerity are feelings of authenticity. So it's not, one. It's not one or the other. There's blends of both worlds going on in these movements. But I think that's part of the reason that, well, Team Sincerity in the Christian Reformed Church, they're acting the way they act. And Team Authenticity in the Christian Reformed Church is acting the way they act. And they both use institutions and move through institutions towards different ends. So, hope this was helpful. Really appreciate what Kent is doing. Always appreciate CRC Voices and the people who participate in it. I deeply appreciate the fact that many of my listeners who have no dog in this fight are, again, simply fascinated by this. And I think probably because these bigger movements of sincerity and authenticity that are moving through our culture mean that a lot of these dynamics are being replayed in a lot of other spaces. So leave a message. Let me know what you think.